It was raining, the kind of cold, persistent coastal rain that softens the edges of the day in Maine, and I had the kettle on before I had fully decided to stop reading and fold the laundry. The kitchen smelled faintly of lemon oil and the last of the Sunday bread. A blue mug steamed on the table beside a neat pile of envelopes. I reached for the top one, white, standard bill-sized, my name in a handwriting I did not recognize, and the paper under it slid away, thin and square, like a secret pretending to be ordinary. I tore the envelope open with my thumbnail. Inside, a bank statement and a small typed notice. For a moment, my eyes skimmed the familiar numbers, almost as if checking an old coat for missing buttons. Then a single line snagged me. A transfer, 2 months ago, to a business in another town, an amount I could not reconcile with what I thought of as my spending. I set the paper down, and the room inexplicably grew quieter, except for the rain, which kept asserting itself against the window. My husband used to say, in the slow, wry way that was his when he wanted me to remember something, "Paper is the truth a man can't twist." He left a lot of papers behind, folded in a neat square in the bottom of an old jewelry box in the top drawer of my dresser. When I opened the drawer that evening, the jewelry box was there, its velvet a little faded, a small yellowed card inside with his handwriting. "Keep your receipts. Keep your head, keep your heart open, but close the back door." The card was not advice for every occasion. It was the kind of counsel that applied like a lens to some moments and blurred others. That night, it focused. I sat at the kitchen table in our small Maine town with the jewelry box open, the statement in front of me, the rain making small rivers down the pane, and I remembered. 3 years ago, when my hands were steadier, I let Carla take over the online billing because she said it would be easier. Dean had been helpful too, setting up passwords and helping me navigate the bank's website. It is strange how help can, over time, become a domestic architecture in which other people move around as freely as they please. I told myself reasonably that there must be an explanation. I made tea because movement kept panic from setting into the bones. I brewed it weak to steady my pulse and unfolded the statement again. This time I read slowly. Smaller transfers, a series of withdrawals, a couple of odd checks I did not remember signing. I had never kept a perfect ledger. Who does? But I kept a notebook in which I jotted the bigger things: doctor visits, the mechanics, charity checks. At the bottom of the kitchen drawer I found it, its cover soft from use. Page by page I turned. There were notes about the grandchildren's birthdays and the neighbor's fence, but no mention of transfers to a home improvement company in Portland or to a consulting firm in Boston. There were, however, 3 entries in Carla's handwriting, bills paid, and then the dates. To an ordinary eye, it looked tidy. To mine, increasingly not. I had to be sure before I said anything. Saying the wrong thing at the wrong time could open a household full of explanations and excuses that would drown out whatever truth lay beneath. I had to listen before I accused. The house had a floorboard that creaked in the hallway outside my bedroom. It had been creaking for years, the same note every time someone passed. I lay awake that night, pretending not to listen, and caught Carla's voice, low and ordinary in the small hours, on the phone. Her rhythm was hurried. I caught a reference to the account and the word transfer. Then, clear as a pen and cloth, "She'll never notice, Dean. She never checks. It's just sitting there." I did not move. I had learned over decades that people reveal the shape of their choices when they are careless about the sound of them. But that one sentence, "she'll never notice," settled in my chest like a stone. They were counting on my silence. The next morning, I found myself tracing the sequence like a map. Small withdrawals here, a direct deposit redirected there, a convenience fee for an ATM. Insignificant alone, accumulative together. I wrote down dates in my husband's old ledger, numbers with a pencil, not grand pronouncements. My hands shook slightly when I crossed off the entries I could confirm. The betrayal was not cinematic. It arrived in administrative increments, in the mundane grammar of household finance. That made it worse. It made it intimate. It was the kind of thing that could be explained away in conversation, and that, if left unchallenged, would become ordinary. I thought of my husband's cardigan, "Keep your head," and I decided the head could no longer be content with suspicion. It required verification. I called a lawyer who used to sit on the bench and now did some elder advocacy in town. I said nothing about Carla or Dean on the phone at first. I asked plainly what steps one might take if they suspected someone close had access to their accounts and might be misusing it. The retired judge, whose voice on the line was smaller but steady, suggested a meeting in his office, a place where he said paper and authority can be met with other paper and clearer authority. He was practical. He said words like freeze, access revoked, and trust paperwork, and explained in broad strokes that institutions exist to be used to protect those who legitimately need protection. He did not lend himself to theatrics. He spoke like a man who had seen many things untangled when people were willing to look. I told him I wanted to be certain first. He said, "Bring what you have, we'll look together." When I brought the stack of statements to his office, the room smelled faintly of disinfectant and old books. He smiled at me in the way a man who has seen the imprecision of human memory must smile, kind but not indulgent. We went through the statements and he nodded, his eyes moving slowly like a metronome, registering the pattern and the omissions. "This is not carelessness," he said finally, looking over the Maine bank letterhead. "This is access with benefit." He wrote down the names of a bank contact and an attorney with experience in fiduciary law. He closed the files carefully and placed them in a sealable envelope. His hands were precise, which made me suddenly grateful for the small steadiness of my own. I called Evelyn at the bank. I had met her once, standing in the branch, a young woman with sensible shoes and an older cardigan, patient with me when I could not remember my online password. She remembered my voice. She said she could put a temporary hold on transfers and flag the account for review if I came in with identification and a statement. "We don't like surprises either," she said. "We'll treat this quietly." The word quietly steadied me more than any small ritual. There is a dignity to discretion. At the bank, Evelyn handed me forms with clear handwriting. Her presence was procedural rather than sentimental. She explained what the freeze meant without the breathless drama some television shows assign to such things. "It means we look closely," she said. "It means we will pause outgoing transfers. It means your signature on power of attorney documents will be verified. And if we can see any inconsistency, we will hold further actions until it is resolved." She did not lecture me about trust or family. She offered steps that fit into the public square of institutions: paperwork, verification, signatures notarized. I told her, truthfully, that this was not what I had expected to be doing on a Tuesday morning, me and my tea in the rain, and she smiled in the small, efficient way of someone who has been trusted with other people's frailties. "We'll be careful," she said. I remember the parking lot, how the rain had lightened to a mist that left the car glass like a film. I sat in the passenger seat with the envelope in my lap, feeling something like a heavier breath. That afternoon, back home, I took the jewelry box note from my husband's handwriting and placed it on the table beside the kettle. "Keep your receipts, keep your head, keep your heart open, but close the back door." I found a legal pad and started writing, not accusations, not yet, but a ledger, dates, amounts, and who had access. My hands were methodical. The ledger felt like a small anchor. The next days resembled a slow, precise raid. I talked to the neighbor who sometimes brought in my mail when I was at a doctor's appointment. I found that someone had been taking envelopes occasionally, small, apparently insignificant envelopes of bills that had been signed and returned. The neighbor looked embarrassed when I asked. She had not thought it mattered. They looked like they belonged inside, she said. I thought it was helping. That was the modern tragedy, help mutating into taking, convenience into entitlement. It explained, in part, how the transfers had continued without my immediate notice. When I finally spoke to Carla about the account, I sat at the table with a cup of cooling tea. Her hands were busy smoothing a kitchen towel, habit perhaps, or nerves. She smiled with the practiced charm of someone who had always been perceived as the family's anchor. "You've always been forgetful about these things," she said. "That's why I said I'd take over." Her tone was both protective and faintly aggrieved, as if she and I had negotiated an agreement that I had somehow misunderstood. I showed her the statement and the ledger. I did not raise my voice. My strategy, when I could, was to be as plain as a document. Documents rarely need drama. Carla's face changed like the surface of a pond when a wind passes, ripple, then shadow. "We used some for repairs," she said. "The furnace was failing. Dean found a contractor." She was quick to explain. Dean, when he entered the kitchen, wore an expression of mild surprise, as if he had come into a staged scene in which he played the role of reasonable man. "I thought she wanted me to help," Dean said. "She asked me to set up online payments so she wouldn't forget. It was easier if payments went through my account at first until she sorted it." He spoke as if convenience justified a migration of authority. He used the language of logistics. He did not mention consent. I had been young once and had forgiven before. My hands hovered above the teacup. There was a part of me that wanted, with the old reflexes of maternal smoothing, to accept the explanation. I thought of my husband's card again, though the last line, "close the back door," felt like more than a metaphor now. "You can take care of things," I said, my voice even. "But the accounts are in my name. I need to know where my money is going." Carla was quick to flash guilt, apologetic phrases that were half promise. She promised to return mistaken transfers. She promised to produce receipts. But there were ellipses she could not fill, transfers to accounts I did not know, sums that did not correspond to ordinary household repairs. They were not all explained by an exasperating furnace. I insisted on seeing the contractor invoices and the receipts. When she produced them, some were legitimate. Plumbing and roofing paid to men whose faces I recognized from church functions. Others were generic, a typed invoice to home services with a PO number and no signature. I had been young once and had forgiven before. My hands hovered above the teacup. There was a part of me that wanted, with the old reflexes of maternal smoothing, to accept the explanation. I thought of my husband's card again, though the last line, "close the back door," felt like more than a metaphor now. "You can take care of things," I said, my voice even. "But the accounts are in my name. I need to know where my money is going." Carla was quick to flash guilt, apologetic phrases that were half promise. She promised to return mistaken transfers. She promised to produce receipts. But there were ellipses she could not fill, transfers to accounts I did not know, sums that did not correspond to ordinary household repairs. They were not all explained by an exasperating furnace. I insisted on seeing the contractor invoices and the receipts. When she produced them, some were legitimate. Plumbing and roofing paid to men whose faces I recognized from church functions. Others were generic, a typed invoice to home services with a PO number and no signature. It was not a smoking gun. It was, instead, a pattern of tolerance for opacity. At the bank, Evelyn photocopied statements and printed, quietly, a list of outgoing transfers. She had the professional discretion of one who understood the embarrassment that often accompanies familial misconduct. "You can ask for a revocation of any power of attorney," she said. If the signature is inconsistent, we will block third-party access pending notarized confirmation. I did not want to sound like a woman set on punishment. I wanted to be clear about my boundaries, so I asked for steps that restored me to the center of my own finances. Evelyn showed me where to place my signature and how to document my preferences. She did not applaud. She did what banks are supposed to do: create a record. When I called the attorney the retired judge had suggested, he was efficient in a way that felt almost surgical. He said, "There's a process to note the revocation, to notify banks and creditors. We can petition for an emergency freeze if there is evidence of misappropriation." He asked me if I wanted him to draft a formal revocation of any power of attorney and to assist with appointing a fiduciary who reported to me rather than to an interested family member. I did. I wanted the decision to be legal, plain, and beyond easy contestation. I remember the day the bank called me to say the account had been temporarily frozen. It was a small victory, administrative, not dramatic. I was ironing a shirt I did not plan to wear anywhere when the phone rang. The sound made me look up as if surprised by a guest. Evelyn's voice was careful. "We have placed a temporary hold on outgoing transfers and flagged the account for review," she said. "We will inform you of any attempts to withdraw or redirect funds." It was not closure. It was a hinge, a point at which the house could swing either back to the way it was or toward an unfamiliar, steadier quiet. And sitting there with the phone in my hand in a small house in Maine, I realized I could freeze not just one account, but every account they had their hands in. Carla called that evening. Her voice was a mixture of anger and pleading. She knew the freeze would complicate things. "You don't understand," she said. "We were counting on some of that for the children. Dean and we thought we were helping. You were never going to notice all of it." There it was again, the assumption that I would stay in the dark. "We'll set that straight," I replied. "I may be old, but I noticed, and I froze every account that had my name on it." There was a silence on the line, heavier than the rain. "We can work on a schedule," she offered. "We can make payments." I had to decide what help looked like when the giver was the person who had taken advantage. My husband's card lay in the jewelry box like a tiny legal talisman. Keep your heart open, but close the back door. I chose, at that moment, to keep the heart open and the back door closed. "I will help," I said slowly and honestly, "but not with money I cannot see. If you need a loan, we will paper it and sign it and make a plan." There was a long silence on the other end. "You're hard," Carla said finally, with the old judgment that had followed us across years. "You don't see the needs." I thought about the granddaughter who liked to bring me string knitting needles, and the boy who would bring me blue stones from the beach. I thought about the neighbor who brought me mail, and the woman at the senior center who arranged trips to the library. The life I had built, the routines that kept my days oriented, depended on some money and a lot of small faith. It was not charity to demand clarity, it was dignity. The confrontation, when it came, was not a dramatic storm. It was noon and sunny, and the rain had finally stopped. I had invited Carla and Dean to the table, ostensibly for a conversation, tea perhaps, a look at how the household should proceed. Instead, I had the printed bank statements, the ledger, and a copy of the revocation order the lawyer had drawn up. I placed them on the table one by one, each a small, decisive act. They made no sound, but they were the kind of silence that compels attention. "These are the transfers," I said. "These are the dates. This is the revocation." My voice did not wobble. Carla's face registered surprise, then anger, then something like grief. "You can't do this," she protested. "You can't cut us off." Dean reached for my hand and paused. I did not let him take it. The gesture seemed performative, a way to assert closeness when the concrete was at stake. "I'm not cutting anyone off," I said. "I am asking that future transactions be made with my consent. If you need assistance, we will document it. We will not take." Carla accused me of cruelty. Dean accused me of overreacting. I listened as if hearing a radio in another room. Their protests, sincere in their own emotional currency, did not change the paper on the table. The bank had already been notified. The attorney had placed the revocation. The law was, in this case, a blunt instrument of fairness. There was a moment in the middle of the conversation when my sister came by. She had been in the neighborhood and popped her head in because she could tell by the tone of my messages that something had shifted. She looked at the papers and then at Carla with a generosity that softened no edges. "If you took advantage," she said simply, "there has to be restitution." She did not call my daughter a thief. She called for accountability. It was, unexpectedly, a moral contagion. Carla left that day in tears, not theatrical tears, but the honest kind that come when someone realizes the shape of their consequences. Dean lingered, less defeated than annoyed, as if the whole situation were an inconvenient. We did not make a heroic reconciliation. Life, I had learned, rarely deals in sudden conversions. But out of the immediate aftermath came a small administration of justice. The transfers ceased, the accounts were reorganized, and an independent fiduciary set up a schedule for payments on my terms. After the house regained its rhythm, I found life taking on a slightly quieter possibility. The curtains seemed brighter for the fact that I chose them. I began, cautiously, to attend the senior center's afternoon card games. It was not a grand life change. It was tea with a new acquaintance, a knitting circle I had been to before, and an opportunity to listen to other lives. There was comfort in small domestic constancy, the way the kettle sang, the particular creak in the hallway that had been my eavesdrop, the jewelry box with my husband's curls of paper and his aphorism. The box, once an anchor of memory, became also a ledger of future intention. One afternoon, a retired judge from the center, a man with silver hair and a voice that had the smooth authority of someone who'd been in courtrooms, sat across from me and told me about volunteer opportunities at a legal aid clinic. "We need people who know how the world looks from this side," he said. "People who can testify to patterns you saw, to the way small things add up." He did not make me a crusader. He offered a way to be useful with measured scope. I agreed, more because the work kept my mind organized than because I sought to be public about what had happened. What came back to me in those months of slow recovery were small acts of agency. I made appointments on my own and kept them. I paid for a class in watercolor and learned, with the funny stubbornness of late bloomers, how color could suggest rather than explain. I returned the neighbors' kindnesses with pies and small casseroles. I lent an ear to a woman whose niece had moved away and who needed an older friend for grocery trips. The money, once dispersed and then partially restored through settled accounts, was not the point. The central thing was that I had been returned to myself. Carla asked for forgiveness in fits and starts. Sometimes she wrote notes, awkward, ashamed lines folded into envelopes. Once she came by with a small box of my husband's favorite tea and left it on the porch with a card. "I'm sorry." I had by then learned to receive apologies without rushing to accept from them a restoration of what was lost. Forgiveness is a process, not a pastry, and I set it on the counter to thaw, not to be eaten immediately. At night, when the house grew quiet and I could hear the occasional passing car and the distant bark of a dog, I would open the jewelry box and read the little card again. "Keep your receipts, keep your head, Keep your heart open, but close the back door. My husband had given me permission in that small hand-scripted mandate to be pragmatic and loving at once. It was not a contradiction. It was a compass. People asked me later if I felt vindicated. The word felt harsh on the tongue. I felt, instead, clarified. The sense of violation had been a soft erosion that left me feeling porous and unsure. Restoration was not dramatic revenge. It was the return of boundaries and the resumption of ordinary pleasures. The right to send a check on my own schedule, to know where the money went, to choose who could access it. It was, in a way, the simple recovery of privacy. There were lingering moments that required attention. A few payments were reversed after documentation. A bank official called to ask for further identification. Friends and neighbors weighed in with their takes. I kept my ledger in a drawer near the kettle, a private map that reminded me of the steps I had taken. Sometimes I would run my finger along the spine of the notebook and feel the small, reassuring dent where my hand had pressed the pencil into the paper. Months later, on a clear morning with the salt wind from the bay, I sat with a volunteer from the legal aid clinic and listened to a woman whose granddaughter had been taken into state care because of financial instability. The woman's hands were trembly. I told her, quietly, how a bank had paused transfers and how a lawyer had drafted a revocation that put authority where it belonged. I did not give her a list of steps. I gave what I could, the names of people who had helped me, and the moral clarity to look for patterns that speak of entitlements dressed as help. I told her that the dignity she deserved was non-negotiable, that asking for it was not being mean, but being wise. When Carla and I finally found a cadence that worked and agreed upon schedule for support and occasional visits, I felt something like relief, not because everything was repaired, but because the terms were visible. We could choose to come together now with clarity rather than without it. The children resumed bringing me stones and knitting needles. Life continued to offer its small good rituals. I found myself, in the aftermath, beginning to teach a watercolor class at the center. The students were slow and particular. They wanted practical instruction and a place to make mistakes. It suited me. The slow burn of recovery had given me patience I had not known I still owned. There were nights still when the floorboard creaked and I would listen and remember the hush of a conversation overheard, the smell of the sealed envelope, the specific tilt of Carla's voice when making excuses. Those memories did not embitter me. They taught me to be clearer in the margins of my life. I learned, too, that regret sometimes looks like a kind of tender, people begging to be let in after they have erred. There is a difference between asking to be welcomed and expecting to be given the keys back. The town did not pronounce judgment aloud. People noticed, perhaps, that I attended meetings more often, that I had returned to baking for the church bazaar, that my watercolor class had become a small, steady program. It suited me. The slow burn of recovery had given me patience I had not known I still owned. There were nights still when the floorboard creaked and I would listen and remember the hush of a conversation overheard, the smell of the sealed envelope, the specific tilt of Carla's voice when making excuses. Those memories did not embitter me. They taught me to be clearer in the margins of my life. I learned, too, that regret sometimes looks like a kind of tender, people begging to be let in after they have erred. There is a difference between asking to be welcomed and expecting to be given the keys back. The town did not pronounce judgment aloud. People noticed, perhaps, that I attended meetings more often, that I had returned to baking for the church bazaar, that my watercolor class had become a small, steady program. They saw a woman who had been unsettled and then made careful choices. That, more than any spoken vindication, was the quiet recompense. On a particularly soft autumn afternoon, when the light slanted like a promise through the curtains, Carla came by with one of the children and left without much ceremony. She had grown quieter. I noticed in her a kind of sober attention that sometimes follows trouble well weathered. We sat at the table and drank plain, respectable tea. She did not ask for money. She asked instead for recipes and for tips on how to mend a sweater. The smallness of the request felt like a truce. I do not imagine that our family is restored perfectly. Trust, once fractured, is not repaired by a single gesture. But the house had a new architecture now, in which I occupied the rooms I had always lived in with a steadier sovereignty. The legal wrappings, a revocation here, a fiduciary there, did their small clerical work. The larger human work was slower. Conversations with a daughter, afternoons at the center, the patient assembling of a life that had been cracked but not shattered. Sometimes I would place my husband's card back in the jewelry box, cover it with the small familiar clasp, and feel his voice in the corner of my ear. Keep your receipts. Keep your head. Keep your heart open, but close the back door. The card had not been a rule so much as a way of seeing, an insistence that love did not require blindness and that vigilance could be an act of care. The account, once frozen, had been reorganized. Payments were made clear, schedules were established. When the bank sent the final confirmation of adjustments, Evelyn's note was brief and kind. "We've put protections in place," she wrote. "You have the final say." It felt, in that letter's modest sentence, like a restoration of agency. I had thought in the beginning that the discovery would change everything in a single dramatic moment. Instead, it revealed itself slowly, an unspooling of small denials and small confirmations that, added together, formed the shape of something that needed to be addressed. The work of responding was not spectacular. It was paper and patience and the decision to be both loving and firm. It was learning to let the kettle cool, to write the ledger, to sit in a legal office and have a man with judicial habits look at the paper and say plainly, "This is not right." My final act, if there is such a thing in a life of ongoing days, was to begin to teach a small class at the center. How to recognize the signs, how to organize papers, how to insist on clarity. I taught not as an expert, but as someone who had been surprised into wisdom here in Maine. I told them, without rancor, how a convenience had become an entitlement and how institutions could be asked to lend their procedural muscle to private dignity. The students brought knitting needles and quiet eagerness. They asked practical questions, and then, toward the end of the second session, one of them looked up and said, "You make it sound possible." I thought of the jewelry box, of the ledger, of Evelyn and the retired judge, and the steady, necessary business of institutions. I thought of my husband's small, weathered card. I answered, with the calm I had learned to cultivate, "It is possible. It's not easy. It's necessary." Outside, the coast wind moved the leaves like a soft applause. Inside, the kettle sang faintly. I poured tea for the class and left a small plate of cookies in the center, not as a celebration, but as a quiet ritual, a way to mark the ordinary goodness of being able to make choices for yourself. The back door remained closed, not out of fear, but as a hinge for a house that had learned how to let people in on better terms. If this justice story from Maine touched something in you, even quietly, don't walk away without honoring that feeling. Subscribe to Mature Justice so you don't face these battles alone. We share more true stories of women protecting their money, their dignity, and their lives, one decision at a time.